Now it's time for a long patrol, which is always something I enjoy doing. And to be honest, it's always something I enjoy thinking about. And I have been playing around the sound settings, so hopefully, for those who keep inquiring, it is going to be a little bit louder. Hopefully. So, 2 heads up. First of all, Happy New Year. This is coming out on New Year's Day. Secondly, yes, I'm using my Brewships mug because my other one's in the wash. And I suppose thirdly, expect some rather harsh academic phraseology to be used at several points during this video. Life happens. Anyway, background to these crises. Well, you can go through a lot of history when you start talking about this. You can go through a lot of history. And it's one of those interesting things that you sort of read and go, oh, not this again. Why is this happening again? A lot of repetition going on here. Now, in 1879, the Dual Alliance is formed. This is Germany and Austria-Hungary. And in many ways, it's formed as part of Bismarck's overarching system. It's supposed to be the public alliance. It's a nice central one. It gives Germany a good, strong ally to their south. And theoretically, it puts them in a commanding position in Central Europe. This itself gets expanded to, in 1882, to the Triple Alliance, where you add in Italy. And now you have a very, very solid bloc down the centre of Europe. The same year it happens, the Anglo-Egyptian War takes place. And Britain goes, whee! We have the Suez Canal. In many ways, they were forced into this because you have a government which really doesn't want to do this sort of thing, actually doing it. But, you know, life happens. Romania sort of joins the Triple Alliance in 1884. And when I say sort of joins, rather like Italy, they will not join their colleagues in the war in 1914. Principally because it's a defensive alliance, don't you know? And they decide that what Germany and Austria do is offensive. So therefore they don't join. And both of them end up joining the Allies. Plus, Romania never publicizes it, which is why it's never called the Quadruple Alliance. In 1887, Bismarck achieves his crowning glory in many ways. The very secret reassurance treaty signed between Germany and Russia. It basically says Germany doesn't care about the Russian sphere of influence. And in as long as they do not end up, Germany doesn't go to war with France, and Russia doesn't go to war with Austria-Hungary, they will never get involved in a war between Germany and a third power or Russia and a third power. It is a treaty which is both full of meaning and meaningless in a true way. Basically, the idea is that, well, let's say in the Russo-Japanese War, Germany wasn't going to get involved and start attacking the Russians in Europe. It's great. The Russians can concentrate on the Japanese. That went very well. And in a war between Germany and Britain, Russia wouldn't get involved. Unfortunately, Bismarck resigns and Kaiser Wilhelm embarks on Weltpolitik in 1890. And in the same year, the Reassurance Treaty is not renewed because the Germans think that a German Foreign Office persuades that wonderful, knowledgeable person, Kaiser Wilhelm II, that the Russians are getting too much out of it. It's a secret treaty, which basically says we respect what's already yours. And, oh, please don't join a war again unless we sort of... It's, there is literally nothing in it. It is almost a pointless piece of paper, but it's extra confidence. It's why it's called the Reinsurance Treaty. It's insurance. For some reason, then, in 1891, the Franco-Prussian alliance, or the Russian-French rapprochement, begins. I can't think why. And then the Germans go, oh, they're surrounding us! Well, yes! What did you think they were going to do? They had a treaty with you. You decided to default on it. So they agree another treaty with someone else. It's the entire joy of the treaty system. Napoleon would have taught you that. The 7 Years' War would have taught anyone that. But no. Apparently it didn't click for the Prussian aristocracy which was running Germany at this point. In 1898, officially the Anglo-German naval race starts to kick off. Unofficially, been going on for a little while before then. Just the two navies weren't too bothered about it, but the politicians were. 1902, the Anglo-Japanese alliance is signed. Now comes the interesting thing, because if you are a historian of a European event, and please let me explain this one. If you are the sort of historian who likes to concentrate on only events in Europe because they're the only ones that matter, and I'm always delighted to know that they are such a small group of historians, you will ignore this and then say it's the signing of the agreements which become known as the Entente Cordiale the next year, well, in 1904, 2 years later, which are the end of British and splendid isolation, which actually doesn't exist and never happens. It's just it's a paper term at best. But I would say, if you're going to actually say Britain was existing in splendid isolation, but when you look at the reality, splendid isolation seems to involve a lot of bilateral agreements and diplomacy going on, and a huge foreign office team. And a lot of international trade. It's just amazing all the things which are going on, which are a lot of connections, despite it being called splendid isolation. I would say the Anglo-Japanese alliance is probably more of that, because let's be honest, one is alliance and an actual alliance, in they use the word. The other one is the Entente Cordiale. Please note that when it became eventually the Anglo-Russian Entente Cordiale Entente takes place in 1907, it's technically called the Anglo-Russian Convention, which is one level below Entente, and definitely that I would say is one level below alliance. So yeah, I think it shows the British realpolitik, to use Bismarckian phrase rather than the Weltpolitik of Kaiser Wilhelm. And basically, the British realpolitik is who are our order of priority and opponents. Japan is useful as an ally because it allows you to balance Russia and the French in the Far East. You can concentrate on the fighting European war. They have to remember that if you end up in a war with France and Russia, and remember, the war, the alliance and text of it is very, very interesting. It's basically says as if you end up in a war with one power, no one's coming to help you. But if you're in a war with any combination of any two enemy powers, then they will come to help you. So basically, it's if France and Russia decide to gang up on Japan, or France and Russia gang up on Britain, they're also going to have to deal with Japan. If they gang with Japan, they're also going to have to deal with Britain. That's some clever diplomacy. There is also the Pendacaris affair in 1904 and the Russo-Japanese War in 1904, which thankfully for France, they don't get involved. Because if they got involved, they'd have found out very quickly that alliance outranks Entente. Which could have had a big impact on World War One, because if you don't have the friendly relations between Britain and France, then you could have forced Britain to a very different diplomatic policy. Would they have sided with Germany? Not while they're building up a navy. But there are conservative elements in Germany who might well decide that getting rid of their navy and getting rid of their navy minister, more importantly, i.e. Tirpitz, you can still build up a navy, but take your time about it and not have Tirpitz running the shows, could be a sacrifice worth making for a Anglo membership of the Triple Alliance. This all leads to the first Moroccan crisis in 1905, but I have mentioned the fact there's a Pendacaris affair before. And this one almost ends up with a Franco-American war over Morocco. This is how tetchy France is over Morocco, which they haven't yet formally taken control of. That will take place in 1907. There's then the Anglo-Japanese. Then in 1905, Moroccan crisis, HMS Dreadnought is launched, and the Anglo-Japanese alliance are renewed. 1906, the Pig War between Austria-Hungary and Kingdom of Serbia, and please do not look up how many times we have gone to war over pigs. And I don't care if it's a commercial war. I don't care if, in this case, basically the Austro-Hungarians decided that we are going to strap Serbia to us by making it difficult for them to import their pork into our nation, and then suddenly, hang on, meatpacking plants funded by French funded by French companies with British bank loans. Start growing up, and suddenly Serbia is exporting meat around the world. And eventually, Austria-Hungary is forced to back down over it. And then there's the Bosnian crisis, which goes on between 1908 and 1909, and then finally the Agadir crisis in 1911. But this is what happens first, the Pendacaris affair. The Pendacaris affair is an interesting experience of a gentleman of, let's say, American citizenship, although there is some interesting stuff with the Greeks, but he hadn't completed the process of becoming a Greek citizen, so he's still an American citizen, gets taken by a gentleman who will end up being played by Sean Connery in the movie adaptation, although, to be fair, we can consider its version, its equivalence to reality based on the fact that Mr. Pendacaris becomes a very lovely young lady. That its mind, Razuli becomes Sean Connery, and yeah, it all... Yeah, that's kind of a heavy adaptation, and Theodore Roosevelt becomes even more erudite in that movie. Anyway, basically, you end up with the Americans sending roughly 7 cruisers like this, the French getting worried the Americans are going to demand a naval base, or at least a port in Morocco from the Moroccans, as part of the eventual settlement over it. The British having to send HMS Prince of Wales, a battleship, to literally sit between the American cruisers and the French, because they are both being testy and it looks like there's going to be a war. But interesting enough, I'm fairly certain the orders for Prince of Wales were try and keep peace as long as possible. And if they look like they're actually going to fight, withdraw, because we don't want to be in the middle of it. We'll let them do it. And again, this is interesting because there's the Entente Cordiale sign, but the British have no desire to get in the middle of a war between France and America. They're not going to get involved in that. Mainly because why would they? The French have virtually no navy, so it'll be over quite quickly. So any war with America would end up being the British having to take the lead and fighting it. And the British don't care enough about Morocco to actually want to go to war over Morocco, let alone go to war over French pride. So that ain't happening. In which case, this would probably end up being a interesting war of depending on who the British decided to sell the most coal to. Okay. Although, considering the positioning of the Great White Fleet and where it is in the world at this point and where it will eventually be, and the fact that it's currently depending upon British coal moving around, that could have been interesting. The British could have ended up using coal diplomacy to bring the war to an early close. Or they could have decided that, frankly, the French ego needed taking down a peg or two and keep supplying the coal. Which also might have had the healthy advantage of building up a good relationship with the United States and making the relationship between the Americans and the French more difficult. Yes, we're talking about an age of realpolitik. We're also talking about an age of, unfortunately, overly supplied with people who are leaders of countries who really are not competent enough to be there. The only person who you could describe as remotely confident in this gallery of facial hair is probably Declasse, French foreign minister. However, even he's interesting because he seems to believe the Entente Cordiale is an alliance. There are agreements as part of the Entente Cordiale, but calling it an alliance is probably stretching it a long way. The Entente Cordiale is an entente. It's an agreement over colonial issues. There is functions of an alliance within it, but it is very carefully worded because the British have very strict lines on what they will and won't get involved in. And you start to realize very quickly that the British are, in a way, adapting the political policy of what they were doing during that period, which is famed for its splendid isolation. In that, there wasn't splendid isolation. There was always a pragmatic level of diplomacy. There was always agreements. There were always things which had to be settled by diplomacy, otherwise they'd be settled by war. This was the British extending that policy. Honestly, it comes to something, though, when I'm not going to say Moali Abd al-Aziz is not the most incompetent ruler there. In fact, he's probably the one given the hardest tasking because he comes to power young, he has virtually no decent training, and he has the joyous thing of being a plaything of various major powers near him who all have far more, how do I put this, far more control over their own countries and own resources, and are able, therefore, to marshal their forces far more effectively. He never seems to have any reliable advisors, he never seems to have any reliable allies, and he ends up losing his throne to his brother, which tells you exactly how much reliability he can place even on his own family. I'm not saying he was actually competent or would actually have done a good job. I'm just saying that, frankly, he was dealt such a bad hand that you cannot actually judge him based on it. However, the award for the most incompetent, most silly, most wacky doodle personality here goes to Kaiser Wilhelm II, who has an ego only exceeded by his ignorance. He is the world's smartest fool. He is sure he knows everything and absolutely knows nothing. And unfortunately, you do get rulers like that occasionally. Britain has had them herself. Charles I. However, this is a man, and I have said this in lives, and I will also say this in long vlog, who managed to make even the Louis of the French monarchies, the various Louis, Even the ones who decided to have separate foreign policies running from their own, i.e., would have a secret foreign policy with secret being implemented by secret agents alongside the official foreign policy their own government was implementing that they were in charge of. We're talking absolute monarchs who had two foreign policies going on at a time, which were actually opposing each other. Even they make more sense than the foreign policy pursuits sometimes achieved by this particular gentleman. He seems to presume that simultaneously he can achieve the great feats of being the smartest person in the room and being able to pull the wool over everyone's eyes and make everyone believe what he wants them to believe all the time, and change his positions, and the world will just let him get away with it. And then there's Paul Barlow, who frankly is good at managing up, but terrible at the politics down below. But they're in a system which was not designed for them to run it. And you need to be a lot smarter to run the system which had been established by Bismarck than Barlow or Kaiser Wilhelm ever would be. So, we have the first crisis, the Tangier crisis. Now, as said, during the Perdicaris affair, very nearly we have war between the French and the Americans because the French are so worried the Americans are going to get a port in Morocco. And this is the Americans, who frankly no one at this point is really that worried about. Then the Germans turn up. Not just any Germans, Kaiser Wilhelm himself turns up in Tangier. He meets the Sultan's representatives. He meets the Sultan, I think. He rides around the city on a white horse while he's on his summer cruise. Sorry, I'm shouting. But it's a little bit absurd, okay? It's silly. It's how not to do foreign policy. And his great and wonderful idea is that he announces to the world that he had come there to support the sovereignty of the Sultan. This is a leader of a country which France is busy trying to turn into a colony. They haven't got there yet because mainly there are technically Ottoman interests, definitely Spanish interests, and frankly the British are going, there's nothing here worth fighting over. We know, we've checked. What are you all doing? No, in the end, it becomes down to Morocco. I'm sorry. At this point, it's putting red on the map. There isn't really anything there which anyone really wants. These days, there is a lot of nice stuff there, and there are a lot of nice people there, and a lot of nice people there then. But if you're an industrialized nation and you're looking for things for your colonies, the only thing Morocco really has is geography. I.e., it gives you an Atlantic port, which, let's be honest, France already has attached to their own country. It might be argued to give you some sort of say over the comings and goings in the Mediterranean, but the trouble is Britain has Gibraltar, and unless you have a far larger navy than the Royal Navy, it ain't gonna work. So there is really no use. Anyway, unfortunately, as he's had this great pledge of support from a great world leader, the Sultan decides to reject a set of French proposed governmental reforms. It's nice to know that the French are proposing reforms to someone else's government. I just love that people used to do that. And issued invitations to the major world powers to a conference which would advise him on necessary reforms. This is a power move. There is a few problems with this. One, when he sends his people to the conference, they won't have any translators. they will now, by having everyone else there, they suddenly get spoken over because there's now lots of other different voices in the room who are all bigger and more powerful than you and have a lot more battleships. Yeah, a lot more battleships. Furthermore, when Theophile the Classe decides, that's the Foreign Minister, decides there was no need for declares there's no need for a conference, Bello, to support his Kaiser, threatens war over the issue. And Kaiser Wilhelm, realizing what he's done in Bremen, states that my study of history has encouraged me to strive for world domination. My study of history hasn't encouraged me to strive for world domination. Sorry, I misread my own notes. Also sounded so wrong. In the empire of which I dream, the German emperor will be trusted by other countries and must be seen as honest and peaceful neighbor. Okay, so literally the year before, you actually witnessed it almost went to war because of America. So America having ships there because of one of their citizens. And so next year you decide to go and visit there on your summer holidays and do that. You see, I think this is why he got rid of Bismarck. If he pulled that stunt on Bismarck, I think he might have had an accident with a mole a la William III, or possibly some very interesting apple cider a la, I don't know, John. There are ways. The French cancel all military leave in June. Germany threatens to sign a defensive alliance with the Sultan in June. Maurice Riviere, the French Prime Minister, refuses to risk war with Germany over the issue. Someone at least realizes how valuable Morocco is. Delacasse resigns, which is possibly useful. As the French government no longer supported his policy. And so France agreed to attend the conference. Everything you'd hope starts to calm down. However, on the eve of the conference at Algiers, Germany decides to call up reserve units. This is in December. And France decides to move troops to the German border in January the following year. It could have been interesting because at this point we know what the fleet flagship would have been, HMS Dreadnought. We also know that Fisher might well have decided he had to command the fleet himself, because the only other option would have been Beresford, because Jellicoe wasn't senior enough. But we do know the Royal Navy was being very, very well used. Wilson's an option. Probably Wilson gets command of something. Anyway, Algiers conference is called to settle the dispute. And, well, how does it? Who turns up? It's one of those conferences where everyone turns up. Germany, of course. Austria-Hungary turn up to support their friends. Great Britain turns up to just mostly to see what the frick's going on. France turns up, of course, because they didn't want to be there. Russian Empire turns up, just happy to have been invited. Spain, hello. Don't we have Morocco? Not you, France. The USA is there. We're in the same room. We've just come to watch what and laugh at you, Britain, for what you're going to have to deal with because they're your neighbours, not ours. Britain going, we hate you. Carry on. There is the Kingdom of Italy. Morocco, of course, itself is there. Netherlands are there. I'm not sure what dog they have in the particular fight, but they turn up. The Swedes are there. Again, another nation which... What interest do they have going on in Morocco that means they're turning up to this conference? Portugal, I can understand them being there. Again, they think they own parts of Morocco. Belgium. Why? Was there a spare seat at the table and someone just fancied it? The Ottoman Empire. And the languages of the conference that things are written in are French, English, and Spanish. Well, it's hosted in Algeciras, Spain, so of course it's going to be written in Spanish, English, and French. You might notice there. Morocco. What's their official language? Arabic. And it was Arabic before the French occupation. And there's also Berber. What there isn't is English or Spanish or French before the occupation, really. And the Moroccans don't have any translators. The Germans don't think to supply them translators. They end up having to borrow translators from, to be honest, from the French. An Algerian translator, in fact, from the French. Germany sent Joseph de Radwatz and Christian Count of Tattenbach, who banged the table and were scary and loud. Britain sent a gentleman called Arthur Nicholson, who would go on to be known as the first Baron Carnock, was a career British diplomat and politician who had a distinct understanding of the things that needed to be happen and needed to go on. He also knew exactly the right moment to call in the Royal Navy. Algeciras is lovely. You can see in this picture, it's wonderful. You can also see in this picture the Rock of Gibraltar. The combined Atlantic and Mediterranean fleets appear in harbour. They are big, they are scary. This all started with gunboat diplomacy, with someone on their summer holiday in their royal yacht turning up and causing trouble because they can't keep their mouths shut or speak diplomatically. It was dealt with by naval diplomacy. Pretty much by Britain going, yes, we're all equals. Yes, this is a multipolar system. But of you all, you are all land powers. Well, hey, we are a maritime and naval power. None of you are going to get to Morocco unless we agree it. So, let's all calm down, stop threatening war, because otherwise we're going to have to hit you over the head with this rather large mallet known as the Combined Royal Navy Fleets. And let's start behaving like diplomatic adults. You don't want to have to do it, but it is a form of naval diplomacy. Modern equivalent would be, I don't know, an aircraft carrier turning up near an international conference and everyone being invited on board for dinner. It works. Everyone gets to look around it, look around the task group, and everyone gets to think, this is lovely. This is a wonderful space, this hangar. There's lots of food. The people are all smartly dressed. The ship's well maintained. Yeah. This looks like the type of thing that can cause a lot of trouble if they want to. Because it's one thing reading about a battleship or an aircraft carrier or even a large cruiser on a piece of paper. It's stats. It's a drawing. It's a picture. It's quite another when you walk on them. There is an impact. There is a presence. There is an emotion when you walk into this big, powerful mass of ingenuity and steel. This thing which sits there. And there is a stillness and a presence to it, as if you sort of realize it's power on a leash. As long as it's on that leash, you're fine. But if the owners let it off that leash, you're in trouble. And that's what you start to realize. You're looking around, you're seeing young, fit, intelligent crewmen and officers going around their business, doing their duties. You're seeing experienced senior officers, senior NCOs, very competent, knowing their duty. You're seeing a well-maintained ship, a well-drilled ship. And you're looking at it and you're seeing a lot of them. And there's a difference. There is a big difference in that the equivalent that's often given in the army is, changing the guard, the parade. And those are powerful. Those are potent symbols of capability. But they're always heavy on the ceremony. There is pomp and ceremony on the ship. But that ceremony is merely a small part of why they're there. They're not there for the ceremony. The ceremony is something nice. Cherry on top. That's what the ship is for. And you very quickly can understand the impact of the ship. After the crisis is over, and the poor Sultan has basically been dethroned in all but name in many ways. The Germans sit back and look, and, well, the Entente Cordiale looks strong. It does. The British, French, and the Spanish signed the Pact of Cartagena, which is, again, please note, alliance, Entente, Pact, Convention. The pact basically recognizes everyone's interests in the Mediterranean and the Atlantic as being their interests. And we all agree that we accept those interests as they stand. It's nice words to write. The British are even agree to sort of divide up, spheres of influence in Persia and confirm certain details of Russians to try and minimize colonial disputes with the Russians. The Russians are still feeling pretty humble after the Russo-Japanese War, and they're now looking at this as a scenario, and basically the French are going, we need you two to get along because we could end up fighting this about these guys, and we want everyone to be friends. And British are going, okay, but that's being a convention. Which, again, it's a level you have to start looking at these phrases and start thinking, why? Why are they choosing? And always remember, in diplomacy, words are chosen very, very carefully. Words are chosen incredibly carefully. And in many ways, it shows how much faith they have in an agreement, what words they pick for that agreement. They have great faith in Japan, which is rather interesting thing considering what we know happens in in World War II, but that's a long way away now. At this point, it's still an alliance. It's great faith. With the French, it's an entente. They think the French will be okay. They don't think the French will go back on their words. With the Spanish, it's a pact. They don't see any reason for the Spanish to go back on their words, but then they like them to join the Entente, but they need to sign up a bit more before they join the Entente. With Russia, it's a convention. Britain has been almost fighting Russia a lot more than Germany. Yes, there might have been a naval race, of which the Anglo-German naval race is the most visible part, but as I've been over it many times in all the Dreadnought videos, there was not just the Anglo-German participants. There were a lot more than that. It is a lot of fighting and a lot of jockeying for position in that race. But the continual problem for the British for the last 50-odd years by this point has more often not been the Russians and their expansionism, not the Germans. It's like World War II and 1939. When I talk about the Tsing-Tao and the likelihood of Britain going to war with Japan in January 1939, when they've got ships actually pointing guns at each other. Similar incidents have been happening with the Russians. Let's be honest. After the Dogger Bank incident, there is a very high likelihood, if the coin toss had gone a different way, the British could have got involved in the Russo-Japanese War. Then it's very unlikely you have the Anglo-Russian Entente or even convention in 1907. So it's one of the things I have to try and explain is that for World War I to work to actually happen is an incredible course of events, which if they'd split any other way, it could well have not happened at all, or we could be dealing with a very different conflict. The second crisis is even more stupid, because this is actually started, I would argue, by the French. Okay, so the French actions in Morocco have undermined the Sultan to such an extent there's actually a rebellion against him. The rebellion is in the internal. It's the Berber sections. It's inside, not the coastal regions. The French well, how do I explain it? In February 1909, France and Germany agreed that while France would have exclusive political control, the nations would uphold each other's economic interests in Morocco. In 1911, they therefore forced the Sultan to sign a new treaty wherein he promised not to sign any other treaties without French approval, which violated the earlier agreement, the one at Algeciras. The idea was that this would cause trouble between Britain and France. However, the Germans forgot one thing. Britain didn't give a flying hoot about Morocco. It didn't have any interest there. Anyway, what it does do is cause, as I said, a rebellion. And the French then forced the Sultan to request their assistance and prepare to send troops to help out and put down the rebellion under the pretext of protecting European lives and property in Fez, when there was no rebellion going on anywhere near Fez. They'd actually dispatched the flying column by the end of April, and then in June 1911, the Spanish deployed troops to Larache and Alcazar, fearing French annexation of the whole country, because they claim Morocco. Everyone claimed Morocco. No one had told the Moroccans. So, then there ends up being an interesting conversation going on between the French and Germans, which results in the Germans sending, because there's now this massive rebellion on which is a threat to life, they actually send a gunboat, the Panther, to Agadir, this little tiny ship, under the pretext of protecting German trade interests and civilians. Well, the French have said, there's such a huge threat, we're having to send an army. There isn't. Honestly, what they needed to send, probably, some troops would have been useful, but honestly, more important, what more would have been useful to send is, I don't know, some equipment, some training, and some support for the Sultan so he doesn't keep looking like an idiot on the international stage because they keep deciding to basically use their muscle and bully him. The Panther was replaced a few days later by the Bremen-class cruiser, SMS Berlin. And they had recovered a single civilian, Herman Wilberg, who'd journeyed 110 kilometers to arrive to get to the Panther for protection. There were so many German civilians in Morocco. It really was terrible. They were fraught. Anyway, the British involvement, it basically resolves around two groups: the groups who are pro-Entente and the group who are non-interventionists. The non-interventionists, who make up the majority of candidate, are basically saying let France hang itself because they're the ones who started this mess. The pro-Ententes, Grey, Lloyd George, and Asquith, well, they want to support the French. Although Sir Edward Grey did try off by telling what the French contemplate doing is not wise, but we cannot, under our agreement, interfere. So the British have been going, we can't interfere because we have an agreement with you, but we don't agree with what you're doing. And then when Grey had suggested to France that Britain might accept a German presence in Morocco, the French government replied that such a government would breach the 1904 Anglo-French agreement. Having read those agreements, I don't think it would have. I think the French are reading a lot more into those agreements than was actually there. And I think the thing is, the ones who are pro the Entente in the British government are prepared to let them. This all leads to various interesting David Lloyd George making a speech at Mansion House, which is to go round his own black benchers. The vast majority do not agree with intervening on the side of the French. You have to remember there is a lot of feeling in the UK that is not supportive of the Entente Cordiale, and not it's often when we read history back, because of the Great Sacrifice and all the things that happened in World War One, there is often a projection that there must have been this feeling there. There wasn't. It's the enemy of my enemy is my friend, or the lesser of two evils scenario for the British government. It's not something which is necessarily as massively popular in the UK as you'd hope, considering the number of lives which end up being lost in World War One. Now, one of the interesting things is that in the midst of all this crisis, Germany is hit by financial turmoil. Stock market plunges 30% in a day, and there is often an idea that it was the French finance minister who orchestrated this crisis. I'm not certain about the French, but I would say if I'd been going to pick anyone, it would be the British. Mainly because the British have far more connections into the finance system than the French do. Far more stable and far more secure government for doing those sort of things. And more importantly, the British have a lot more form than the French for doing that sort of thing. And it deals with a nice problem for the British government. Remember, the British government don't want a war. They don't want to test the Entente Cordiale at the point there's currently issues. They don't want to test these issues. They want the crisis dealt with. And it also has the added benefit of weakening the Germans longer term and giving them issues with funding their existing naval expansion. Yeah. I could see the British getting up to that one. The negotiations end up with the Morocco-Congo Treaty, where Germany gets chunks of chunks of the Congo in order to appease them not having Morocco. It causes resignations all round. It causes issues all round. And it causes the French to draw the idea that as long as they're firm with the Germans, they will back down. Because as Raymond Poincaré, the premier who succeeds Caillou in 1912, observed that whenever we have adopted a conciliatory approach to Germany, she has abused it. On the other hand, on each occasion when we have shown firmness, she has yielded. The sad thing is this has all sorts of interesting issues and consequences for this whole crisis. For starters, it causes Oswald Spengler to write his terrible work, pseudo history, as I like to call it. In that, no, there are good bits in it, but honestly, it gets so obsessed with being able to predict the future. It's just not good history. But the quote that's often given is sort of the Agadir crisis certainly raised the spectre of a general European war and strikingly revealed the danger of Germany's encirclement by the Entente. Really? Suddenly? Suddenly? What? Was everyone believing the Entente didn't exist prior to that point? Also, the Entente is still not enough firm. Anyway, what it does do is it does deepen the Entente cordiale. Well, that's what's always described as saying, because the British and French then conclude a secret naval agreement by which the tiny French Navy, in comparison to the Royal Navy, agrees to concentrate their fleet in the western Mediterranean and leave the rest of the world to the British. That's pretty much what happens. We can all think about the reality of the French fleet trying to fight, theoretically on this point, the combined Italian and Austro-Hungarian fleet. How long before they end up having to call in a Royal Navy battle squadron? I would argue slows down the decommissioning and the getting rid of pre-dreadnoughts is literally because they have a theory they might need some of them to go and back up the French in the Mediterranean. Or they might need some of them to round out the numbers with the Grand Fleet, while some dreadnoughts go and back up the French in the Mediterranean. They are very, very much thinking that the French will not end up. The reality of that scenario is not going to be as French and as Franco as theoretically the agreement seems to suggest. I don't know. I'm skipping past that book. That book just annoys me. Anyway, what's the cumulative impact? Well, the cumulative impact is this. The world is heavily arming, and there's a lot of naval arm that's going on. But the point is, it's not as aggressive a scenario as we often imagine. War is not predetermined. In fact, the alliances are strong or weak depending on your perspective. And I would argue that they are strong or weak depending on the people implementing them. Because if you have one form of government in the UK, I think if you had a conservative government rather than a liberal government, you could have had a very different scenario, because the liberals are far more francophone than the conservatives at this point. I could certainly, well, how do I put this politely? Balfour might have been Prime Minister when the first of the agreements went through, the Conservatives with the French. But the Conservative reading into the Entente Cordiale and the Liberal reading, especially under Asquith, reading into it, is very different. I'd say even Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman, who is the Prime Minister in between, is different. And I think the French reading of those agreements is different depending on who's in charge. This is the point. It's not an alliance, it's an entente. It's as strong or as weak as people wish to make it. Make it. It's the Entente Cordiale. It settles colonial agreements and basically says we're friends. Well, I'm friends with a lot of people. It doesn't mean I'm going to hit someone for them if they're attacked. Most people, I'll probably stand in the way and go, calm down, stop it. But actually going offensive just because you hit them, that's, well, that'll depend on the context and nuance. If you're hitting a kid, yeah, sorry. But if it, well, not sorry actually, if you're hitting a kid. But, if they're no, but let's say it's a group of friends and we're all fairly big, fairly active. It's gonna make me sound possibly slightly sexist, but let's say blokes, because as I've said before, in various points of price, my dad did hit when he was drunk my mum and sister a bit. One of the reasons I don't drink, I don't want to run the risk of ever being like that. But that means I have, I know I have the tendencies that if I see a guy hitting a woman, I have to be more controlled and in my measure of getting in between. But so this is why I'm using that scenario. But if you're sort of scenario groups, guys, all about my size, height, and level of athleticism, and two start hitting each other, and I'm not particularly friends with them, the odds are I'm gonna ask them to draw apart. I'm not gonna start hitting the guy who's attacked. But if they hit my best friend, any one of those three, i.e., my allies, well, they've probably got they're probably not going to enjoy the result. So this is the point, and that's probably far too much personal information to explain it, but it's me trying to give the context to the explanation. This is the point when we talk about all this. Did this lead to World War One? It adds color to the context and the nuance and the thought process. But really, there are lots of issues. There is a Germany which has a political system designed around there being a Bismarck in power, and there's not been a Bismarck in power for over 20 years by the time war breaks out. There is a world system which is designed to be run by people who are pragmatic and, for want of a better phrase, rational, but it's now being designed by being run, has a lot of involvement of people involved in it who are, I would argue, more emotive, ideological. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. You need those people in the world, but the trouble is you need to design your system to be able to fairly work for both groups. And the trouble is the political and international relations system was not designed to work for both groups. It was not it was designed around the level of agreement as we have now. It was designed around the agreement they have then. If you consider nowadays, we have a lot more meetings and a lot more international conferences, and we have the United Nations and all these different frameworks. And that doesn't mean peace is guaranteed, but that means there's a lot more meetings between people. So the people who are coldly logical get more exposure to the ideological people and can have a better understanding of what their thought process and likely scenarios, and the people who are, let's say, more ideological will brush up with the people who are sort of more rational and go, oh, "You're so boring." But it also means that they get an idea of, hang on, I need to bring these people with me. They're not all going to immediately see my vision and then immediately go for it. And that's one of the problems you have in sort of World War One scenario. You have some people have this vision of a world order and vision of a world, which, of course, curiously enough, they're always at the head of. Amazing. It's a world order which they're in charge of. Everyone always thinks that. And they don't seem to understand what's going forward. And I would argue the biggest problem with World War One, if I want to lay the blame anywhere, and if I ever am laying the blame for World War One, I usually blame it in the fundamental misunderstanding of between Britain and Germany. Britain doesn't mobilize its navy fully hard enough to tell the Germans that we will get involved, so back down. And Germany misunderstands British attempts to solve these things as diplomacy, as Britain not wanting to get, as Britain not being prepared to do anything because Britain doesn't want to. When they realize, when there's a difference, Britain doesn't want to do anything, but they will do it. There is a difference. You don't want a war. That doesn't mean you won't fight one. It means you're a rational human being who prefers to not fight a war. It's why Britain's always prepared to spend the money it is on defence in this period as deterrence. Because Britain understands, and the governments do understand, the fundamental idea that if you spend the money on deterrence, you usually don't have to spend the money on war. It had been the British policy for most of the 19th century was, we will keep investing in the Navy, we will keep investing in these things, because as long as we have them, we are able to deter conflict. Because you can't snap your fingers and produce these. You can't go, I'd like ships, please. I'd like Marines. I'd like big guns. I'd like a fleet logistics train and infrastructure system which stretches the world wide. You just can't do that. It doesn't happen. You have to actually build those things and invest them in peacetime. And if you have them, that's deterrence. Because people have to factoring in risk. And that is what deterrence always is. Deterrence is based on what's your level of risk you're prepared to achieve. For this goal, what's the level of prepared risk you are prepared to take for getting that? And deterrence is about increasing the level of risk to the point at which achieving that goal through violent means is no longer a viable option. Because the risk is too great. But you have to balance it so you don't get the deterrence so strong you force them to go a violent option because they have no other route, or they don't perceive any other route. Which is, by the way, one of the reasons why we end up having World War II with the Japanese and the Americans, because the Americans and the Japanese misunderstand each other so much that the deterrence doesn't work. The Japanese aren't doing deterrence properly because they don't publicize their super battleships. They've left the treaty system. No one can be mad with them. They can admit for that because, they've left it. So in 1937, so they could admit they have these super battleships and could use them as deterrence, because then everyone will have to go, sugar, we're going to need to respond to that, and probably fall back and start having thoughts, and the American fleet would withdraw from Hawaii. But also, the Americans don't understand that they are dealing with a Japan that they are. They are thinking they're still dealing with a Japan they can easily boss around, that they can send the Black Fleet to like they did previously. They can't. They can't do that. They need to. They're not, yes, American claim they're a far more prominent nation than Japan, but you still need to work together with a level of respect, and make it work. And again, on the Japanese side, there is a lot of respect missing, so it causes issues. But in World War One, what happens to lead to World War One? Well, basically, you have a lot of politicians trying to punt decisions down the road. Britain ends up going into World War One without a strategy. It doesn't have a strategy. It has a deployment plan for the army. You can say it's made a strategic decision to support France. That's fine. But it's a deployment plan. We'll go where the French send us. And they have a strategy for the Navy. But the strategy for the Navy, naval strategy, depends on having the army to go where the Navy needs it. The army strategy is going wherever the French need them. See a problem? And the fact is, there's been no, even after the debate of the Wilsons, there's no decision made. No one wins the debate of the Wilsons. Or rather, from the reviews, intellectually, it seems the debate is that the Navy wins, but the politicians don't want to back the Navy because that will upset the politics of the army, and they don't want to upset the army's politics are mostly more conservative, but also they are problematic enough. So, and they don't want to. They also are even. This is because they've worked out the naval strategy is more suited to British forces. That's literally the reason the politicians sort of going, oh, the Navy sort of won this, but we can't do it. Because they don't want to get into that political fight. They don't want that disunity. They don't want to have to make a decision. And if you consider the traditional history, many politicians have managed to make great careers by always punting decisions down the road. One of the interesting things, again, is if you had David Lloyd George as Prime Minister in 1914, how different the world might have been. Yes, he is an ardent Francophile. Yes, he is many, many interesting things. But he is also, and you have to admit this, he's going to make a decision. It's the thing people don't like about Churchill. People disagree with his decisions, but at least he makes a decision. That's his main advantage as a wartime leader over a lot of the politicians at the time. He actually makes a decision. It might be the wrong one, but he made one. And the first lesson you'll hear a lot of young officers and a lot of NCOs get taught when they're going through training in military academies is indecision tends to kill more personnel than the wrong decision. Because the wrong decision, at least you're moving, and a mobile target is harder to hit. Indecision, standing there frozen while everyone else moves around you, that can get you zeroed. So, what do we have coming up? Well, we have, on the 4th of January, the Kent-class counties. They're going to be fun. And we have quirky classes and what they tell us about their navies. Fun. Oh, and we have some Patreon suggestions so far. Now, I'm going to actually start the vote on Sunday. But let's see. We have Paul from Chicago. Unverified stories of the Norwegian campaign. Tall tales of tribals. That could be fun. Aaron Evans, RAF Coastal Command. Early war operations. Maybe 1939 to 1940. Fun. James Carroll. Old history. Gilead, Palion, and Thrawn serve in the IJN. James Carroll also. Thrawn and Tarkin. German Empire Part 2. Although both of those could be fun. Will Bolton. Fleet screening. Dreadnought to downfall. And clarifying that Operation Downfall is the invasion of Japan, so the end of World War II. It does make a snappy title. John Hargraves. Alex, I wonder if a piece about shipyards may be of interest. History to extent and geography of all the shipyards that built large and small vessels for the Royal Navy. It could be fun. Now, there are a lot more questions there. I'm glad to see that 13 people have suggested questions, and there's a total of 18 questions being suggested. But there is still going to be a whole 24 hours from this going out that you can be suggesting more questions. So please do, if you want to, go and suggest them. Anyway, thank you everyone for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful New Year's Day, and take care. Enjoy yourselves. And I hope you enjoyed this long patrol. Thank you, everyone. Take care.